If you want to know the impact of an event, there is no better evidence than a pair of photos, one taken before, one taken after. That's what we have for today's video, but it's not a single event we're interested in, it's an entire century. Ordinary photos aren't enough to do the job. I have something better. Maps. One from the start of the century, one from the end. And we'll see just how the world changed from the perspectives of the people living in it. And the century we're looking at is one that I believe is the most important ever in the shaping of our world. The 17th century. A century of tumult, of war and disaster, of bloody revolts and devastating famines, but also a century of unprecedented progress. A century in which the way people viewed the world around them changed dramatically. The history books often overlook it. It wasn't a century of big names, no Napoleons or Hitlers, nor any flashy inventions, not the airplane, vaccine, telegraph, or steam engine. But I say it was the most important century anyway, because it was the century when not just the ideas and institutions, but the required mental frameworks evolved that would make Winston Churchill and the Apollo program possible. Let me show you through these two maps. This is what we do on the Eye of History. Old maps are the window we use to study history, economics, culture, and more. They provide a powerful and unique perspective on history. And if that seems interesting to you, then like, share, and subscribe. It really helps nerdy channels like this one. My personal collection is admittedly a hodgepodge. I'm a little like a crow that picks up any shiny thing he sees. But sometimes I have some method to my madness. One thing I like to do is collect multiple maps of the same area, separated by time. Nothing better expresses the range and depth of change than these sorts of series, and it changes how I study history. It directs my attention to the right questions, and it puts everything I read into a precise context. Stick with this video, and I'll show you that process at work. What I have for you are two maps of Italy. The first was printed in 1640 by the top Dutch cartographer of the time, Jan Blauw, but it's a very close copy of a map made 20 years earlier. The second was printed by England's greatest cartographer, Moll, in 1714. The two maps are close in quality and purpose, and almost perfectly bracket the 17th century. There is a bit of a story behind the Blauw map, and if you watched this video, then you already know half of it. Giovanni Antonio Magini was an intellectual titan, a friend of Kepler and a rival to Galileo. He was an astronomer, mathematician, and cartographer, all of the highest rank. In my video on the Antipodes, I take Magini to task for lazily copying a map of the Americas for another project. In this video, we see Blauw doing the same to Magini. Moll's map, on the other hand, is unquestionably original, although the information it represents was taken from many sources, including published maps. There were no copyright laws back then. Everything was fair game, and there was little stigma attached to plagiarism. For our purposes, this is a feature, not a bug in our approach. These maps aren't the isolated works of lone geniuses. They display the knowledge of an entire generation, sifted and formed by the cartographer into a single work. They could not be clearer windows into the intellectual worlds that birthed them. We'll open with the most basic question. Is the newer map more accurate than the old? We'll start with just an eye test. I'll show them side by side with the modern map. And yes, Moll's map does look more accurate. You see it most plainly in Italy's boot. Blauw's toe extends too far. It seems that all his islands and peninsulas are exaggerated. It's pretty obvious just by looking at it. But let's zoom in on the details. Now our job is tougher. It's hard to compare with the modern map because most of these places either don't exist, moved, or changed their names a few times. I gave up trying to compare towns and villages, and instead tracked a river. The Crati, here in Calabria, down in the boot. Rivers were particularly difficult for early cartographers. Unless the river was navigable, no one really walked or surveyed a river. Only where a river touched a town was a mapmaker sure of its position. The rest he had to interpolate. Let's see how our cartographers fared. This is a little surprising. The older map is much the better. This seems really strange, but it tells us a lot about how these maps were made. At this time, there were no national surveys. For the most part, cartographers had to collect whatever local maps they could, and the quality of these maps varied immensely. Some were commissioned by the local duke, count, bishop, or baron as a management tool. Some were drawn up by a local cartographer just to print and sell. Moll's job was to collect all of these and try to fit them together. Data on the coastlines was more readily available from chart makers. Marine charts have always been a separate specialty, distinct from cartography. Only a few men were both hydrographers and cartographers. Moll's job was to fit all this together, like solving a jigsaw puzzle in which each piece was cut by a different saw. We can often deduce exactly what maps were used as sources in various places, even if we don't have the originals, by tracking how groups of features have moved. In our case, we can see that Moll has Cosenza, Bisignano, and Payola in roughly the same arrangement as Blau. But Disignano and Mandona have shifted relative to each other considerably. Apparently, Moll obtained new data on the coastlines and shifted the east coastline down, keeping most of the interior the same. This, in turn, put a crick in the Crotty River that shouldn't exist. Moll had to make countless changes like this, and overall they improved the accuracy of the map considerably. But it was a process of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. The other eye test we should make is for technique. Here we'll look at the cartouches. Cartouches were perhaps the most important feature of these maps, at least for the cartographer's well-being. The map buyer really had no way to judge the accuracy of a map while he's browsing at the bookshop, but he can study the quality of the cartouche and pray that superiority in engraving and printing will correlate with superiority in cartographic accuracy. Both of these maps were printed with copper plates. Both were hand-colored, but Moll's map looks a little sharper. The engraving is just a little more precise, but more importantly, the imprint is sharper. There was no one great invention in printing that made this so, just many small improvements in materials and methods, but they add up to make a visible difference. There is, by the way, a secret hidden in Moll's cartouche. Check out this video where I explore its unusual history. So we've already learned something important about the 17th century. There are no technological revolutions, but many small innovations adding up to visible and meaningful improvement. Next, let's look at the projective elements. Here the differences are tremendous. Blau provides a fancy sort of grid, with 2 compass roses placed fairly arbitrarily, with rhumb lines radiating from all points of the compasses. It gives the map the look of a real mariner's portolan, but they're actually rather useless. Not that any mariner would be using a map like this aboard a ship. More useful are the markings along the perimeter providing the latitudes and longitudes. And from these markings we can easily tell that Blau, like Maggini before him, did not make any attempt at a real map projection. The map uses just a simple grid, each line of latitude and longitude straight and equally spaced. This might be a little surprising when you know that Maggini was a mathematician and the greatest computational astronomer of his time. He literally wrote the book on the geometry of the sphere, and yet he applied none of those principles to his map. Moll, on the other hand, has no mermaids or sailing ships, but his map has a true projection. To compensate for the curvature of the Earth, Moll's lines of latitude also curve. These circular curves produce what is called a conic projection, as though the Earth were drawn on a cone and the cone unrolled. But not only did Moll use this projection, he very carefully chose the size and placement of that cone to reduce the distortion to an absolute minimum. Here's the upshot. Whereas in the older map, there's roughly a 10% difference in scale from the top of the map to the bottom. On Moll's map, the distortion is less than 2%. Really, undetectable without magnification. So we've learned something really interesting here. It isn't that Moll knew any mathematics that Maggini didn't know. Maggini and Blau could have applied the same conic projection as Moll, but chose not to. All of our cartographers were striving to sell maps, and at the start of the 17th century, being mathematically precise was not expected. At the end of the century, it was. This is a major change in mindset. Now let's see how Bleu and Moll chose to embellish their maps. Bleu provides a great example of what I call Baroque mapmaking. We see the sorts of embellishments that popular imagination associates with old maps. There are a half dozen sailing ships plying the seas. A pair of mermaids flank the cartouche. And to represent his sovereignty over Naples, the personal coat of arms of Philippe IV, King of Spain and Naples. The map Bleu was copying was even more effusive. Just look at these mermaids and sea monsters. What is interesting is that Bleu deliberately copied most of Maggini's elements and just rearranged them a bit. But Bleu left off the sea monsters altogether. They weren't really monsters, but badly drawn whales and squid. Bleu apparently felt that they were just too outdated. Moll had none of these things, not a single mermaid. There are a pair of angels in their cartouche, but that's it. Bleu had a scale on his map. Moll has 4 scales in French, German, Italian, Spanish, and British units. Bleu doesn't have a legend, and he doesn't promise that any of the symbols on his map have any particular meaning. Moll has specific, standardized symbols for bishoprics, abbeys, and of all things, universities. He also has one big thing that virtually no map from Bleu's generation had: roads. Not all roads, just the post roads. The roads all but guaranteed to be properly maintained, and the indicator of whether the mail ever reaches any particular town. This was a major new innovation, a map that could actually be used to plan a trip. In fact, Moll clearly made his map with a traveler in mind. He scattered all over the map little notes, items of interest for travelers or armchair travelers. Here, by Taranto, he put a description of the deadly spiders. Moll is kind enough to describe the antidote to their poison, to dance to music, which dissipates the venom. Moll notes that Loreto was a popular destination for Catholic pilgrims. He says that Corvia has salt pits and exports eels all across Italy. In Tuscany, the lakes of Bagne el Morbo feature streams of sulfurous water. These lakes were famous for curing skin conditions. And here, near the Baths of Bracciano, is where the Pope keeps his navy. The Papal States were actually at their zenith in the 17th century, whereas the Catholic Church itself was in constant crisis. But here's my favorite little note. Bonifacio, the best town in Corsica. That's really all a tourist needs to know. Take the boat here, look around, and if you don't find it to your liking, get back on the boat. There isn't anything better beyond. These little notes aren't entirely an invention of Moll's. Some 16th century maps have text blocks on them, but they're all of a much more scholarly nature. These notes disappear in the 17th century, and Moll is really reinventing the idea with this map, this time with a very different audience in mind. Now you might have noticed I'm saving the biggest features for last. The most striking feature of Bleu's map is the perimeter, populated as it is with a series of blazons, like soldiers guarding the map. This is another feature that he copied from Maggini and altered, in fact, enlarged. The coats of arms are the symbols of the many provinces, justiciates as they were called, of the Regno de Napoli. Think of them as state flags. They are showy and surely helped sell the map, but of no real utility. The most striking feature in Moll's map is on the left, these 3 dramatic diagrams of erupting volcanoes. We'll start with the one in the middle, Vesuvius. In 1631, Vesuvius erupted with a greater force than any eruption since the destruction of Pompeii. The pyroclastic flows and ash falls left 4,000 people dead and the landscape transformed. The accounts of it reached every corner of Europe and led to Vesuvius becoming the focus of a new and fantastic tourist trade. They called it the Grand Tour. The custom began in the mid-17th century and continued for the next couple centuries. Well-off men, mostly of the northern countries, especially Britain, would cap their educations by touring Europe. Paris, Berlin, and Vienna might be on the itinerary, but 4 destinations were absolutely required: Florence, Venice, Rome, and Naples. Naples was a double attraction. The first and greatest opera, and Vesuvius. Europe would become obsessed with both. Many men, having completed the Grand Tour, would publish their diaries and observations, and their descriptions of Vesuvius became the new foundation on an old science. Until that time, geology, not that it was called geology yet, was about identifying rocks and ores, noting which rocks were found with which, the better defined places to mine. Vesuvius inspired a geology of processes, investigations into how the rocks, hills, mountains, and the earth itself was formed. It was impossible to study Vesuvius for any length of time and not suspect that the earth was much older and much more volatile than the old science suspected. It's still too early to call Moll's diagram here scientific, but it is a huge leap not just from older maps, but in scholarly publications of any kind. We see the same attention to natural detail in the other two diagrams. The second is of Etna, which erupted in 1669 and wiped out the city of Catania completely. Etna did not leave many casualties. It erupted in a slow river of lava, easy to outrun, but devastating to the landscape. It never became the tourist attraction that Vesuvius was. It was rather inconvenient to visit, and there were no opera halls nearby. Moll's third diagram is an enigma. It describes a Mount Aeolus, which has 5 cavities from which it calls cataracts of air proceeds. The diagram depicts 5 small cones on the side of the mountain which produce the air. I'd never heard of Mount Aeolus, nor of any mountain that produced cataracts of air like this. It was a fun search to figure out what Moll meant to depict. The AI can be handy in researching these sorts of things, just as a supercharged search engine. And sure enough, it found our Mount Aeolus in the Lipari Islands, a group of volcanoes north of Sicily, also called the Aeolian Islands, named for the Greek wind god. The AI seemed very confident, but of course it was dead wrong. Nothing in that archipelago matched Moll's description, and the AI was fooled just by the name. It took some searching, but I found Mount Aeolus on Moll's map, here, by the town of Terni, which, by the way, is next to the town of Narni, which later became famous for its lions, its witches, and wardrobes. Don't believe me? Look it up. But again, my searches on the internet and modern maps still came up empty. I spread my net a little wider and began looking for the village in the diagram, Chasium. I finally found it, not south of Terni, but north. It's now called Chasi and sits on the shoulders of Monte Eolo, which on all the maps I was looking at was called Monte Sant'Erasmo. So Moll misplaced his Mount Aeolus a little bit. Worse, though, is that Monte Sant'Erasmo is not a volcano, nor can I find any references to cataracts of air proceeding from it. I am 100% sure that I have the identification correct, but I am stumped as to where Moll found these imaginary cataracts of air. I'm hoping that I can crowdsource the solution. If you have any idea where Moll heard of or read of this Mount Aeolus, please let me know in the comments. We can do better together than any AI on the internet. So, whereas Blau's map was adorned with fancy but largely meaningless flags, Moll's map was all about natural philosophy, what we call science today. All educated men in Moll's time were expected to learn the essentials, just as they were expected to read Greek and Latin and be able to recite at least a little Homer. Preferably, that learning should be by direct experience, ideally by taking several years in the Grand Tour. But if that wasn't possible, Moll's map and the diagrams it provides were a reasonable substitute. We have seen that in the technology used, the accuracy, and the level of detail, very little seems to have changed over the century. Everything is just incrementally better. But in mindset, the maps came from different worlds. These two maps seem to be made for two completely different peoples, two radically different cultures. Blau's customer was someone interested in display, not utility. We see this in the compass roses and rum lines, the ships and mermaids, the coats of arms. All lovely, but useless. Moll expected his customer to study the map with a scientific mentality. thus the mathematical precision in the projection. He assumed his customer had enough understanding of geometry to fathom why the lines were curved. And he expected his customer to travel, not just for business, but for the experience. Thus, he left the Easter eggs to help guide him. In sum, Blau's map is intellectually naive. It does not ask the reader to think or look to the reader for questions. But the Moll map is intellectually ambitious. There's a greater confidence in what was known and what could be known, and an expectation that the person reading the map would appreciate both the answers the map provided and the questions it asked. This so well characterizes the 17th century. Most historians find the century rather sterile, worth little attention. It is better known for its disasters than its accomplishments. Disasters like the Little Ice Age, which brought desultory floods, droughts, and the constant threat of famine. Constant war, starting with the 30 Years' War, the most deadly conflagration in Europe until the invention of the machine gun. In fact, many historians call the century an era of crisis, and note that the population of the world, not just Europe, actually declined. They find few signs of material progress. The steam engine, spinning jenny, power loom, they all lay in the future. And yet, the progress was there. But not in industrial goods, but in intellectual ones. It was in our minds and faculties, and their expansion by the means of new scientific instruments. In almost every field of what we now call science, the key discoveries and inventions came in the 17th century. In math, the extent of mathematics in 1600 was not much more than what a modern student might learn by 10th grade. By mid-century, Descartes, Pascal, and others brought Europe up to speed on most of a modern high school curriculum. But near the end of the century, mathematics absolutely exploded as Newton and Leibniz invented calculus. Very few college students today progress much beyond what those two men devised, and a 17th century mathematics education would suffice for all but a handful of modern professions. In biology, the century started with publications like Besler's Hortus Aestatensis, the greatest plant catalog of its time. It was beautiful, but its author could think of no better way to classify plants than to break them up into seasons. Yet by the end of the century, Carl Linnaeus had created the very same classification system that we use today. Again, a 17th century botany education would suffice for most modern jobs in agronomy. In astronomy, at the beginning of the century, scholars were completely perplexed. Copernican theory was conceptually attractive, but is contradicted by every observation made. By the end of the century, not only had Kepler fixed the mathematical problems, but Newton had explained the underlying mechanism as well. Again, a 17th century in physics would make the student overqualified for a job in, say, modern movie making. Much of the advance was due to a plethora of inventions. There was the telescope, the microscope, the slide rule, the barometer, the pendulum clock. Inventions that didn't expand a man's productive capabilities, they expanded his mental capabilities and his senses. These inventions were all small, accessible. Anyone could put their eye to the lens or read the dials and learn. And almost everyone with the means to do so did. The effect was an intellectual revolution, a revolution that carried on all the way through the 20th century. Whether that mental expansion is still in force today, it's a scary question. I fear that access to the internet and the growth of AI is sapping those hard-won faculties. Do I need to worry? Let me know what you think in the comments. They say that the invention of the steam engine and spinning jenny triggered an industrial revolution. Our map showed that the inventions of the 17th century triggered an intellectual revolution. Most historians today are materialists, if not full-blown Marxists, and in the materialist perspective, the 17th century was sterile at best, a disaster. I think they could not be more wrong. There is a great riddle contained in this story, a riddle that I don't think the materialist historians have adequately answered. It seems almost axiomatic that a society that is prospering materially should also be advancing intellectually in some proportion. Conversely, a society impoverished by war and famine, and especially a society losing population, should struggle just to maintain their culture, let alone improve it. Yet the 17th century confounds that notion if it doesn't crush it completely. Why is that? It's a hugely important question, and I can't say that I have a good answer for that. I'd like to know what you think. If you've watched any of the many videos on the crisis of the 17th century, or have read on the topic, how do the views you've read compare to mine? Let me know in the comments. Let's get the conversation going. By the way, my fellow map collectors have given me a sort of endorsement. I bought both of these maps at different auctions and I paid roughly the same price for each, but one of these maps is worth about twice the other. Both were created by successful, popular cartographers, among the best in their respective eras. And the subject matter is the same, and both are well executed by the standards of their respective eras. The Moll map is physically larger, and that can have some impact on value, but normally you would expect that the older map would be worth more. In fact, it's Moll's map that is the more valuable. Moll's maps do exceptionally well for a cartographer of his era. I think it's because of the cartouches. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if so, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you have other ideas that you would like me to explore through maps, let me know. Whatever you're curious about, I probably have a map that touches on it.